I have to do work to undo anti-blackness as a black person,
Right.
and you don't think you have to do anything.
Anti-blackness is and racism is that's kind of unconscious racism that's not just personal hatred
Mhm.
is part of learning to be more conscious. Like it's part of inner work and it's part of if you're interested in your personality, then you need to be interested in class, in race, in sex, and gender. You'd be interested in those kind of biases just the same way we're supposed to be interested in our inner life biases.
The big hormone Enneagram.
Let me lay it on the line. I got a little freakiness inside. Let you know that the man has got to deal with it.
Hi, I'm John Lukovich, sexual self-pres for the 5-wing 458 trifix.
Hi, I'm David Gray, self-pres sexual 9 with 1 974 trifix.
What up? It's Emeka. I'm an 8-wing-7, sexual self-pres with 854 fixes.
Hi, I'm Nancy. I am a self-pres social 3, wing 4, with a 369 trifix. If you like our podcast, guys, make sure you go like and subscribe us on the Apple Podcast app. And if you really like us, you should definitely leave us a review.
So what are we doing again?
We are
This is great to a great start.
I think it's worthwhile talking about all the protests and things like that, just because it's like the thing happening.
Right.
I think that, and it's related to an earlier podcast episode we did, but that, you know, our class and race are like personality types in themselves. And I think that, you know, most, as we've complained about, like most people into the Enneagram, except for like this younger wave, the older generation is like middle class and white. And there's a thing in, you know, we talked about like how just in white people in general, there can be like a don't talk about certain things, quality. And like in inner work, it's this, in Enneagram, it's like the same deal where like somehow when it comes to talking about class and social responsibility or like these kind of bigger political issues or ideology, it's like, oh, but we ought to be really nice and accepting there. Like we can't talk, it's like using spiritual-ish principles of niceness to keep certain conversations from happening so that you can like talk about change and growth, but don't actually change and challenge and make me uncomfortable.
Yep.
People don't realize that they have this massive privilege to just not talk about it.
Yeah.
And it's like people don't want to talk about it and they say, oh, I don't want to talk about that. I don't, you know, it's just going to cause like issues. And it's like, yeah, and you get to go home and not worry about getting stopped by the police and shot. Like, this is your privilege.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I mean, it like someone, I saw a white mom who had a black son say that, you know, like she was trying to reach out to white women to say that you would be burning things down if it was your son or your daughter that was killed and the world got to watch. Like, there's some separation with the ways white people are reacting. Like, they don't understand why people or white people are so angry in the streets. It's like, do you not understand that you don't have people who look like you that are getting killed senselessly by the police? Like, you can't watch or see a photo of what happened to know that someone's life was taken because, you know, a cop put his knee on his neck for 9 minutes and killed him.
Right.
And like, that is, if that doesn't infuriate you, then how do you care about life at all?
Yeah, and part of this quote unquote personality type of being white is to identify with the owners of capital and property. And so, you know, there's an automatic, like when people say looters, unconsciously, white people identify with the people being looted from.
Right.
And they think, oh, isn't that so awful to be looted from? Meanwhile, they're not identifying or empathizing with the black people getting fucking murdered.
Yep.
So everybody feel like online, everybody felt this need to like condemn looting, and like, you know, all it does is serve to make you feel better about whatever you get to condemn and feel above, and not understanding one, looting is just what happens when there's a social breakdown. And if you murder people with impunity and with just getting a license to kill people,
It's a fucking social breakdown.
And when you put people in quarantine and you don't give them any fucking money and they lose their jobs and their work, there's going to be a social breakdown. So if white people were looting it'd be a totally different fucking story. But this was a way that white people could be online and like weigh in their thoughts of solidarity with the cause, but also kind of like, go, oh, but I don't condone looting, and almost make it seem like looting was somehow an invalidation of any sense of like being able to side with people who are obviously overtly and blatantly being oppressed.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just like it's cowardless.
Yeah, and if you noticed that while all that looting, the stories of looting were happening, the media was highly focused on it. And
Exactly.
that kind of shit has died down. Like that's not happening anymore. And the media has diverted attention from these protests because it's like you don't actually want to face the real reason why people are upset. It's like, similar to the way people approach the Enneagram. It's like you talk about not a four and people start making deflections about, oh, you're too mean about the way you're doing this, like tone policing and all these other things. It's like it's a way to not actually deal with the central problem because it's uncomfortable. So all this, but the looters and all this other, it's just a deflection. People don't want to talk about race. People don't want to talk about police brutality against Black and brown people. They don't want to talk about. They don't want to actually deal with that problem.
Well, they don't want to deal with the problem that they are also racist.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean,
No, I
that's
mean-
it. It's the same thing with the Enneagram. They don't want to do the inner work. They just want to say they're doing the inner work.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, Emeka, I think you brought up that being not racist is not just like a passive, like, I don't hate Black people, but it's actually like working to
Yes.
counter the racism that we just naturally have as a product of being conditioned in this society.
It's
Yeah.
it's huge. Even as a Black person, this is something that I have to work on because anti-Blackness is in the air, and it's hard to explain sometimes to people like what that feels like of having to feel like you need to justify your place. And it's not even a conscious thing. It's like an unconscious reminder that you are not what's expected and that you have to justify. So all these expectations that are put out in the media, like, okay, let's say like Black people aren't supposedly educated. So you, on some level, internalize that. And so let's say you're sending an email. This is something my sister told me. She's sending an email and she's like doing extra work to check the grammar,
Mhm.
maybe like being
Yeah, like you're not given the benefit of the doubt.
right. Like you can't fuck up.
Right.
Where white people seemingly grow up with the impression that they are the standard, that this world was created for them, the system was created for them. So there's no self-doubt and just like, the confidence that a white Chad has, just like put up videos and just show his face and be like, just put up whatever bullshit that he wants to share with the world and not even think for a second that people won't receive it. Whereas as a Black person,
Yeah.
you have to feel like I need to be exceptional.
How's this going
Because-
to be perceived?
Yeah,
You're
you're
like
already
unconsciously representative somehow.
right.
Yeah.
Like you internalize the sense of otherness that you have to justify. And I realized that some of the things that I said about eights as a rejection type, some of this is just being Black. Some of this is
Yeah.
knowing that
Mm.
I have to justify my place on some level. I'm not on some level supposed to be here. Like, and it's internalizing some sense of I'm not central.
Yeah.
They're central. And so I have to justify myself. And that's internalized racism. And so it's
Right.
like it's like an overlay personality that I have to work on. It's like let's say I want to be messy because that's just the way I want to be. But then it's like I have to think about, well, Black people think Black people are poor if they're that way.
Right.
But white guys don't think about that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
They can just dress like hobos and nobody thinks that they're poor.
They think they're fashionable.
Exactly. So that's
Yeah.
kind of like the kind of stuff that I have to undo. It's like, where is that coming from? I didn't learn that in a book. That's just something I absorbed from being in a sort of white centric society.
What,
I was part of a race unity group about 30 years or so ago, and one of the things that was interesting was a Black person saying that when they got on an airplane one time and they saw a Black pilot getting on the plane, that made them concerned that it was a Black guy, right? That kind of thing. Yeah. Which
That
is
was-
like, wow, I hadn't even thought of that, of course,
Yeah.
So even Black people have internalized racism. So if I
Yeah.
have internalized racism, and then compared to someone who's white, who the system is there to reinforce your own sense of this, the center or superiority or whatever, like you have it even way more than I do. And
Yeah.
so like the idea that you don't think that you have to do work to undo that is completely idiotic and ignorant. It's like I have to do work to undo anti-blackness as a black person,
Right.
and
Yeah.
you don't think you have to do anything.
Yeah.
Well, I think that, from my perspective, anti-blackness is and racism is that's kind of unconscious racism that's not just personal hatred
Mhm.
is part of learning to be more conscious. Like it's part of inner work, and it's part of if you're interested in your personality, then you need to be interested in class, in race, in sex, and gender. You'd be interested in those kind of biases just the same way we're supposed to be interested in our inner life biases. And
Yes.
so, like a lot of times, I think white people feel like they want to be good, and like there's this. Okay, well, I don't feel revulsion against any black people, and like, I don't feel like I think negatively about black people. It's like I feel good. And same thing we talk about with levels of health, for example. It's
Yeah.
like, oh, I must be healthy because I have a good attitude. And it's
Yes.
like the level of health is not a measure of attitude. You can be miserable and whatever and still have a high level of health. It's not about being nice. And then there's also like another kind of version of this is acting from like I need to just erase my guilt and like putting links to black businesses on my Instagram page, which I'm not saying that's good or bad. I'm just saying that's like there can be an action that's like trying to erase it rather than confront it. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's people don't. I don't think people want to. Even black people don't want to address how deep of an issue it is. It's like figuring out your type. Some people want to stay at the top level descriptions and be comfortable with sort of these things that they can read and barely understand and move on. But knowing your Enneagram type is like you start getting deeper and knowing that this is a whole dynamic and there's another layer and another layer, and then you realize this is the kind of psychological work that I'd have to do to have a handle on this. And so like when it comes to racism, it's not enough to be like, oh, I'm just gonna make a decision to not hate black people. It's so subtle. Sometimes black people feel like only other black people can really understand what black people deal with. Most black people aren't necessarily worried about dying at the hands of the police, even though that's possible. It's unlikely to happen. It's like what you'd have to deal with on a daily basis that only maybe another black person truly understands, like what it feels like to walk into a room. No one is looking at you, but you know that everyone is aware of your presence and is actively ignoring you. It's a very weird sensation, but every black person knows what that feels like. It's almost like a hidden contempt, that's just out there when you're in a white space. And so when I say something like that to someone who's white who doesn't have any fucking clue about their own or any awareness of what the way things are like, people get really defensive and they start saying things like, racism is all over the world. We deal with
Like
this.
that makes it okay.
Yeah, it's like, this is a universal problem. We all are prejudiced in some kind of way. It's just to stop us from talking about anti-blackness, to stop talking about this problem that's here right now.
Yeah.
I keep saying it, but I just for like because of listeners, but I feel like examining these kinds of perspectives, biases, and feelings is the same exact work as what we're trying to do with the Enneagram. So, like to me,
Yeah.
it doesn't seem different where you're trying to confront things and be impartial with yourself. Like how do I see that I'm participating in and acting out anti-blackness, for example, in a way that I'm not aware of? And so
Yes.
I can feel bad about it, but I can't just use it as an excuse to attack myself because I'll use that excuse to shield myself. It's like going to hurt too bad to even see it.
Yes.
To prevent me from being curious about it. And it's going to be this sort of moral penance quest where
Yeah.
I'm like kind of performing allyship or whatever and using one thing always like I mean people have their own feelings but whenever people talk about like black bodies and brown bodies it always sounds a little morbid like like
Sounds super morbid.
it's just like talking about bodies instead of people. It just sounds weird but they start adapting a certain language and it's sort of which whatever but it's like there's a way to address it and then there's a way to overcompensate for it. It's just like the personality types where it's like you're addressing something versus like, oh, I'm a 7, I'm out of control, let me go to 1 to kind of control myself.
Yeah, or just performative,
Yeah.
saying that I'm dealing with it, like the Democrats dealing with those can take claws. It's
Yeah,
like you're
I
not.
feel like that was not cool.
It's that was offensive to me. Like,
Yeah, I saw that and I was like, I don't think that's okay, guys.
because it's like levels. It's like different. They don't even know that they're acting out something that's a meme within the Black community. Like people make fun of performative Black people that are doing performative pro-Blackness with Hotep, whatever. And one of those things is wearing kente cloth. And so you've got Democrats kneeling, like they don't even fucking understand what those things mean. So it's another level of I'm just performing pro-Blackness when I have zero intention of making any changes whatsoever. So it reminds me of how people in the Enneagram will sometimes say, "Oh, I'm healthy," but they're not actually. They don't have any intention of doing any work. They don't have it because it's difficult. It's hard to actually confront yourself. But they're just going to skip to the end and say, "I'm a healthy person," but they're not actually making any changes. And so I see a lot of parallels with the way people deal with something like this with the way they deal with inner work. It's very similar.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's not about reaching the summit pinnacle of I'm no longer racist, because it's the same
Mhm.
thing with trying to reach the pinnacle of like I'm enlightened. It's like no matter how long you've been doing inner work, no matter who you are, no matter how deep it is, you're gonna be a dickhead sometime.
Yeah.
Yep.
You know, like, and so the aim is not to pretend like, and I mean all the guru shit and all that kind of stuff. It's like when people start seeing themselves or other people start seeing people as over the finish line, you're deluded yourself. Like the part like inner work and outer work or whatever you want to call this cultural work is about continuing to have the willingness to confront where you're asleep.
Yep. My friend and I were talking about this, I think yesterday, and we were saying, as a white person, if you aren't constantly asking why you're having that thought, you're being racist.
Yeah.
Because
Like,
you
what
have
thought?
like an assumption. Like if you hear on the news that someone broke into something, you instantly think, oh, you imagine that person in your head as a Black person, and you don't instantly think, why am I thinking that?
Mm,
You're
yeah.
being a fucking racist.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's like, and all white people are doing that because we've been conditioned to
Yep.
do that.
Yeah.
So if you aren't constantly asking yourself why you're having that thought, you aren't doing any work.
Yeah, and even amongst Black people, let's say I hear a story like that. Usually, maybe my first thought is, "Man, I hope he's not Black." You know what I mean?
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
it's like, where does that come from? Because it's like the media has just pushed this thing in our face, and so the images that we conjure up when we think of crime have been Black people, and so when it's not Black people, we're surprised, and so it's just continuously reinforcing itself, and it's the same thing with the media that we consume. Like for the longest time, and we have more diversity now, but for the longest time, like all leading men and leading women are white. I mean, even as a Black person growing up, like that has a huge effect on you. Like, the movies that you watch and your favorite film characters or whatever are white people, and that has some impact in terms of as a sexual type, for example, like in terms of beauty standards. Just as a teenager, that's like a very pivotal time in terms of insecurity
Self-image.
around your self-image, and so like I remember there was a period of time where I wished that I had certain features that were different. Like just because you're growing up and you just feel awkward and you're just thinking, oh, I wish my nose was like this or whatever and this like that. And this is just like so stupid. But I'm surrounded by white people. I watch, white films. And so like what's being put in my face in terms of beauty standards is I'm unconsciously absorbing that this is what I'm supposed to look like. And like you don't realize that that's what's happening.
Mhm.
And so that's it's addressing sort of the unconscious layers of like a racial bias that can make someone who is Black, for example, feel uncomfortable in their own skin. And this is like on a level that you're not even conscious of. You have to actively try to unpack where those feelings might come from because you're just sort of taking it in because it's just all around you. So I mean, if that's something that I have to be aware of and I have to do work on, it's like white people have to do that.
Yeah. If you have to do
Right.
work on it, we have to fucking do some work.
You
But listen,
know?
I watched Black Panther and I enjoyed it.
So that means you have
You watched it
reached the
twice.
summit.
I watched in theaters. Okay.
Some heavy lifting. Right.
You
You
voted
know-
for Obama the second time.
Yeah.
But maybe not the first.
Another piece of this too is that people have, I haven't seen this as much, especially as time has gone on, because we've seen more videos of police just being flat out abusive assholes.
Hmm.
But people would be like, well, the police have a really hard job. And again, that's a white there's a whiteness there because, I mean, yeah, maybe some cops do, like,
Yeah.
I could imagine. And I'm not saying it's like one way or the other, but there's an identification with those who enforce the structures that maintain the society.
Yep.
And, the reason we have police, it stems from slave catchers.
Yeah.
And it stems from policing is inherently tied into property ownership and property control.
Yeah.
And I live in Bushwick, and to get to my friend's bar, Marina, who we had on the call before, I have to walk through these projects, and they are like it's like an occupying force. Like there are police cars with the lights on at all times of the night, and these like New York City kind of like they're like these big lights shining everywhere, and it looks like an occupying force. And I think that there is a way in which I don't know if this is true for all Black people, but I think that there's a way that Black people can feel like they are an occupied colony within the imperial core of an empire or something,
Mhm.
and that they're the ones that a lot of the policing energy and maintaining society energy is directed against. The sort of their existence becomes like the negative force to the active force of the state. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, it's that's why I get really upset whenever people say stuff like black on black crime and they don't realize how the state and the system conspires to create crime and focuses all their energy in policing black communities. Like even here, it's such a stark contrast here in Chicago because on the north side, that's where all the white people are at, and if you go to the south side or you go to the west side, that's where every cop is. Like if you drive to the south side, there are cops everywhere. And so people say, well, that's where the crime is concentrated. Well, it's like, how do you think that happens? Like
Right.
when you look at city planning, crime is concentrated in this part of the city because it's poor. And why is it poor? Because the city keeps it that way. Like they don't divert resources to those parts, and there's not enough schooling. There's not enough education. There's not enough opportunity. So people, of course, are going to do what they need to do to survive. It's like if you were white and you were in a poor neighborhood, guess what? You'd be doing the same thing. So this is not a black thing. This is like an environmental thing. But it's like the cops go to those areas and they're more likely to lock up black people. So what do you have? So you have a bunch of black people going to prison. And of course, the media puts that stuff in our faces. And so it's this fucking cycle. It's like, so when you
And
think black people, you think crime and poverty and
and class analysis has to be in here, and understanding things like historically, like redlining and
Mhm.
yeah.
like we just passed like the anniversary of the Tulsa, Oklahoma bombing.
Oh,
Like where they
Jesus.
just fucking massacred people. And I grew up in Georgia, and I've been sharing cop shit like crazy on social media, and found this like Twitter like screenshots of a Twitter thread of I think a writer from The Root, like that online whatever, and he was talking about all these different basically race wars that we had after the Civil War, where we kind of pretend like, okay, after the Civil War,
Racism
racism
was gone.
it was a
Yeah.
little bad, but like we kind of got over. But there was actually wars
No.
between the KKK and different militias, and there was this whole thing where black people were actually voting in a lot of black politicians,
Yeah.
Yeah.
and so the KKK would have full on wars. Like, and like there are some of them are literally like I don't even remember the names, but they're like they have
I
a
wouldn't
name in
I
battles.
wouldn't even call them wars. These are fucking massacres.
Yeah,
They were
exactly.
just-
Yeah,
They were hunting and
Ambushes.
killing black people. Like just like the government couldn't. It was maybe you say that it's a war with the U.S. government because the government, of course, didn't want them to do this, but they were fighting for the rights to be able to kill black people.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. No, I mean
It's-
it was sanctioned by the U.S. government, but it was like they would have like these so it'd be different factions of the U.S. government because there was black representation in the government, and so
Mhm.
it'd be some of them versus like all the white people versus the KKK that were working with the white people working with the state government, and the reason it happened is because the government was supporting the KKK. It wasn't like the government was like, we got to step in.
Yeah, you got to read about this because people think there's a lot of fucking insane shit, race shit that happened after the Civil
Yeah.
War. Like just like terrible. 'Cause you know that
Incredible.
show on HBO, the Watchmen reboot that they did?
Yeah.
There's a scene in there where they describe that whole Tulsa thing, or they showed black people getting killed, bombed on, by planes, and I don't think most people think that that actually happened.
Right.
That
I had
actually
no
fucking
idea that happened until this year. I literally had
Right.
no idea.
No, I didn't know either.
Yeah.
Yeah, same.
see this is what I'm talking about. Like,
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's the shit
Yeah.
that they just brush over in history
Oh,
class.
yeah.
They're like, oh yeah, none of this ever happened. Like I am always consistently shocked on a weekly basis about what I didn't learn in school.
yeah, and even as a black person, there's still a lot that I don't know, and some of it I can't even, like, I have to take it in small doses because it's one of those things that
Yeah.
you don't realize how horrific things were, for black people in America. And so as a Nigerian, African people sometimes, come here and they're really industrious and they're smart and they went to school and all this stuff. And so they come here and you kind of have the mindset of an upper class person who's above this kind of shit. But looking at the history can help African people empathize and understand, like, yo, black people in this country have been terrorized for centuries. And I mean, just like the worst stuff you can imagine. So you're telling me there was a black Wall Street where they were economically independent and white people bombed them to the ground and killed hundreds of black people? That happened after the Civil War? Like, I only learned about it a few years ago, and I was like, what the fuck?
I learned about it from fucking Watchmen. You know? God damn it.
Yeah, it's insane. I mean, yeah, it blows my mind.
So it's like when people are aware of these sort of atrocious events, and to know that these events weren't that long ago. I mean, Martin Luther King Jr. was shot not that long ago. So they can't just brush this stuff under the rug and be like, oh, things are okay now. No, they're not okay. Like, racism is still, it's just a little bit different now. Now it's just cops get to kill black people and get away with it.
Well, yeah, like part of what I've been disappointed by is like a lot of like upper middle class, older white Enneagram people that love to talk about inner work, but then like, there's this sort of discomfort with taking a real stand
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
not being murky because it's like, oh, but you're being aggressive. And it's like, well, yeah, like part of inner work is like you don't always do it right. You don't always find the right solutions and the right stands, but you need to live in the world of personality and you need to live in the inner world. And you have to do both at the same time. And like you can't be wishy-washy when like if you don't resist something like police violence or any of these economic factors and personal factors that we're talking about, if the resistance is not strong enough, it persists, but it gets a little bit more insidious because it gets just acceptable enough that it's not like, okay, black people aren't getting like hung up in the town square, but they're getting murdered by cops. And it's
Yes.
it takes a lot more education to show people how this, and therefore more work and time to show
Mhm.
people how this is the same thing as that. It's just changed form. And so if your resistance is not strong enough, it just makes the negative force stronger,
Yeah.
It kind of reminds me of like when you have an infection and you take antibiotics. Like if you
Right.
stop it too soon, then the infection finds a way to like get around those antibiotics, and now is like you can't take those antibiotics for it because it's just going to live through that. And
Right.
yeah, I feel like it's the same thing. If you don't do all of the work, it's still going to stay, but quieter and worse.
And like, so, you go to these protests or like, whatever, and you have to resist all these people with body armor and guns pointed at you. And like, yeah, you have to stay awake in your inner life, but you have to do both. Like
Mhm.
and like, there is a way I think that if you can be in contact with the humanity of the police performing inhuman actions, but you resist them from the body center with all your might, and it's not like taking a stand itself is the negative thing. It's like when we take a stand and then we get stuck in a position and stop learning and stop being awake. It's like we got to take a stand, but do the best we can. Like when it becomes a rigid inner dogma or just a tension or just a default, then we're asleep. But if like we have to keep learning and educating and wanting to see ourselves.
Mhm.
And like, I mean, what started me on my whole socialist thing was learning about the instincts. It was just like, oh shit, way our society is organized is not good for the human nervous system, and what are our alternatives? So it's like we have to like can't get too stuck on anything as the solution, but you have to keep pushing.
Yeah. I've never had a gun pointed at me until last Monday. And I'll tell you what,
Wow.
that's the most fucking terrifying shit I've ever experienced. And that will wake you up real quick. And that's why I'm so pissed. And that's why I'm inviting people to these protests. I'm like, get scared because
Yeah.
you need to
Yeah.
fucking be scared.
Yeah, I will admit that I didn't get it until I had a gun pointed at me by a couple cops. Like
Yeah.
I had to be awakened to the seriousness of my situation. Like back in the day, my sister was more aware of, racial issues in this country than I was. And Crash had come out. I don't know what year that was. That was probably around 2006 or 2007. And that movie, I saw it and I was like, they're really playing this up. Like, this racial thing. That was my honest impression of what was going on. I thought it was a well done movie, but I felt like they were dramatizing the whole thing. And little did I know that movie was like underestimating the amount of I didn't know. I was not even, it was like that experience opened my eyes to all the stuff that I had been experiencing that I had no idea about.
Hmm.
Like that just shows how asleep that you can be, even though you could be the target of something like this. So it's like discovering that was kind of like discovering my Enneagram type. It's like,
Yeah.
oh, this whole thing had been going on this whole time. I didn't have any fucking clue.
Can you tell that story of what happened?
So I lived in 2006 or 2007. I was living in Austin and I was living in a nice part of town, white neighborhood, and I was outside of my apartment and all of a sudden two cops show up with their guns drawn
Mhm.
and asking me who I was and what I was doing there. And I said, I live here. And my roommates had a pit bull at the time, and I was taking the pit bull for a walk. And so I was like, I need to put this pit bull away.
So you're
Um,
holding a dog too.
Yes, I'm holding a dog, and I'm just like trying to be as calm as possible.
Oh,
and
Jesus.
I need to put my pit bull away, and I can go grab my ID, which my ID wouldn't really prove anything. But they wanted me to show my identification. I guess it would prove that I lived there. Um, and so I put the dog away, and I came out and showed them my ID, and then they put the guns away and said, yeah, well, someone had called the cops because there had been some kind of burglary type of person, and blah blah blah. Sorry that whatever, and that was that. And then the next day, the mailman came up to me and apologized because he said he had called the police on me because there was some black guy who they'd seen around who had been breaking into places, and so he called the police because he thought I was breaking into my own apartment.
I usually take my dog to my break-ins too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Imagine that.
That's the best
thinking-
way to do it.
Imagine that, not even thinking that through, that you had a dog with you. There's no
Yeah.
way you-
So it's at the time, I think I had seen some stories in the news. There was like some black professor who was arrested in his own home because they suspected that he was breaking into his own home. And
my
you read these things in the news, and for some reason, you just feel separated from it. It's like
Yeah.
that's just happening elsewhere. So having that experience made it so real for me that I just started, I started reading and started looking into. I was like, you know what, Austin's in Texas, and Texas is super diverse. Why am I like always the one black person in every room that I go into? Why does Austin have 4 or 5% black people? So I started looking into like the city planning. So this was an awakening to start to look at the conditions of why things that were the way, why I was experiencing some of the things that I had experienced, and made me realize that there were other weird things that had to do with me being black that I hadn't realized. So that was a huge wake up call. And it just made me realize the movie Crash that I saw and I thought was they were making a big deal out of this race stuff, was an understatement of what was going on. It's just, so it's like I had an experience of like discovering my type, basically. Like, oh, this is actually what's happening. This is how people feel about me because I'm black. It's not just a thing that's abstract out there that's happening to random people in the news that they're playing up for some reason. This is actually my life.
Yeah. It's kind of, yeah, it is a lot like realizing your type because it's fucking horrifying when you realize how much bullshit goes on in the world.
Yeah.
Anyway, like we should probably switch
Fun
gears.
stuff. super lighthearted, great.
Yeah, that's gonna
Cool.
be a fun episode to put out.
Yeah. No, I think it's real important to talk about it, especially connecting it with. It's not separate from inner work and becoming aware, and it's
Yeah.
like
Yeah,
it's
the
not
same.
even that. Like I think a lot of people I'll see respond to this kind of stuff as like, oh, you want me to think this and this and this, and it's like, no, you don't have to think anything. Just learn about history.
Yes.
Just
And it will
learn
keep your mind.
facts. Learn
Yeah.
information.
Yeah.
And learn like how to apply a different kind of reading than the automatic reading interpretation of events. Like look at things through different lenses however you want, but if you actually encounter the information, it's so blatant and there and unavoidable that if unless you're a fucking idiot, you'll find something. I think my friend sent me the hard times. It's like the Onion but funnier. He sent me this article that was like, yeah, well, the head, it's like a joke headline. It was like, if I'm not a racist, then why do I have so many like explanations for why I'm not racist? You know what I mean?
Oh,
Mm.
And it's this kind of thing where you have to really insulate yourself to hold your fucking ignorance.
I mean, even going to school here, like you don't realize how much the school curriculum is just a bullshit sort of white ethnocentric kind of lie. Like they're not telling
Yeah.
the full history of what happened, or things are skewed to paint white people and Europeans as heroic. When it's like you grow up, and if you actually do some digging yourself, you realize there's a whole another way of looking at things, and there's a whole bunch of shit that has to do with white and black history in this country that people don't want to know, and people don't want to talk about. A lot of just horrific stuff that if people don't want to allow into their awareness, that would completely change your perspective.
And yourself.